Testing one. Good afternoon and welcome to the mini-series, speaker series on this wonderful Sunday afternoon. And welcome to Paynesville United Methodist Church. I'm Reverend Jerry Kalb and retired pastor. I served here from 1986 to 2015. And so they said I know a little bit about the history of the Paynesville United Methodist Church, although Mary Ann Jacopin, who is our church historian, can tell you lots more about the history. But just a couple things to highlight about the Paynesville United Methodist Church. This particular building was the fourth building that the church had. The congregation was started in 1820, and this building was built in 1873. We just celebrated 150 years a couple years ago. If you go to the circle room, which is directly behind me, it was finished first, and they held worship services in the circle room until the sanctuary was completed. And a couple interesting things about the sanctuary. The side balconies were added in, I believe, about somewhere around 1939. They weren't a part of the original building. And before you leave, take notice of the rose window, which is right back there. The youth paid for that window when it was put in at a cost of $300. I hate to think of what it would cost us today to replace that window. That's why we've taken good care of the windows. In fact, several years ago, Bill Parsons and Fred Bufka re-leaded all of the stained glass windows in our building at no cost to us except for the cost of supplies. It was truly a labor of love, and it took about 5 years. But all the stained glass window that you see in here, as well as in the circle room, were re-leaded, and also the protective glass keeps them in good shape. One other thing I will share with you, people have often ask about the pipe organ that was put in 1993. We redecorated the sanctuary, and when the chairman of the trustees presented the idea of redoing the sanctuary, there was a gentleman in the church by the name of Mr. Quine. And after the meeting, he called the chairman of the trustees and said, I would like to have you put in a new pipe organ in memory of my wife, Edna Quine. And that's what you see. He paid for that completely. He gave us a check for $500,000, and we got a bargain because we were able to do it for $453,000. So we had money left over in order to help with repairs over the years. So it's hard to believe it's been here since 1993. I don't know if there's anything else you want to know about the history of the church. If there is, call Maria and she'll put you in touch with a person that can give you as much information as I have. But it's good to have you here this afternoon, and we look forward to the speakers sharing special thoughts and special ideas and special histories about different people in the life of Ohio and the life of our nation. And at this time, I think Jerry Marshall is on the agenda for playing the prelude.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. This is a really exciting time for us. 2026 is celebration of the 250th birthday of the United States. Sorry, it chokes me up a little bit. What an amazing opportunity we have to celebrate this. And one of the reasons it's so special to me is when I was 10 years old, we celebrated the bicentennial. So I just did it. I just told you my age. Anyway, I'm really excited. This is such a neat opportunity. For any of you who are around in 1976, you remember that there were a lot of things happening in our country. People were coming home from Vietnam. We had all kinds of things happen with Watergate and the presidency, and there were just so many things to draw us apart. And I'm looking forward to this year as a chance to celebrate being an American. And I hope you will be here with us. This is one of our first events that we're holding for America 250. As we get started today, I want you to know that we're all very aware of the schedule. I actually have my phone up here because it's telling me what time it is. It's 4:12. As a teacher, I'm very aware of the time. I teach at Lakeland, and if I go 1 minute over, my students will leave. So I will not do that with any of my speeches. On the topic of speeches, for any of you who enjoy history, many presidents and famous orators have been asked about their way of preparing speeches. And one of my favorite quotes that has been attributed to many presidents talks about how to prepare for a speech. This particular quote is attributed to Woodrow Wilson, and he says, "If you ask me about preparing for a speech, it depends. If I'm to speak for 10 minutes, I will need a week for preparation. If 15 minutes, then I'll need 3 days. If half an hour, 2 days. And if you want me to speak an hour or more, I'm ready to start right now." So we will not do that to all of you. We will not make you have a 2-hour speech. But you know that when this church was built, for many of the years of the history of our country, before we had media and modern technology, for entertainment, people would come and hear long, long speeches. So we're so excited that you're here today to join us. The first topic that we're going to talk about today is the Underground Railroad. And as many of you know, the Underground Railroad is not actually a railroad. The Underground Railroad is actually a system that was used to help people move from slavery up through dangerous territories into the northern United States. One of the things that I was involved with starting last summer was a film production, a film documentary called I'm Going Home. And I did bring the poster for that for you. This is going to be screened at Lakeland Community College March 18th. And as part of this screening, we will also have a panel discussion. The panel will be reviewing the different aspects of abolition in northeastern Ohio, and also the fact that we have a very personal connection to that here in Lake County. This movie was filmed completely funded by Chagrin Historical Society. It was also filmed at the Fairport Harbor Lighthouse, and we have several local people who are in that documentary, so you'll want to definitely come out and see that. But the reason this is so significant is that Lake County, and specifically Concord, Paynesville, and Fairport Harbor, were the location of the terminus points for most of the routes for the Underground Railroad. If you look at a map of Ohio, you'll have western Ohio on this side, eastern Ohio on this side, and through western Ohio we had people coming up through Springfield, through the Lima area, up through Sandusky, Ohio, and then they would cross Lake Erie and go into Canada for freedom. If you look at central Ohio, not so many routes, but then you look at eastern Ohio where we are, and we had people coming in from Pennsylvania, we had people coming up through the Youngstown area. There are actually 5 routes that came through Concord Township, Ohio, and those routes all funneled up through Paynesville. So one of the exciting parts of this documentary, I'm Going Home, is the fact that the man who filmed it and wrote it, Skip Church, found out a few years ago that his family is part of the Seth Marshall family. Anyone know where the Seth Marshall house is? Anyone know? It's on the corner of Walnut and Bank Street. And so you might also know the lovely family that lives there now. That family, Seth Marshall, was one of the lead families that helped to create a safe space for enslaved people who were moving from the south up to the north. And there's all kinds of interesting stories, all kinds of interesting twists and turns. One of my very favorites is the fact that there were several enslaved people who were captured. They were going to be taken back south, and the residents of Lake County and Ashtabula County got together and managed to smuggle these two enslaved persons away from law enforcement and to get them safely to Lake Erie, where they could go north. So it's really wonderful to know the history that we have here in Northeast Ohio. A few other things about the Underground Railroad. You may not realize that it wasn't really an organized system. It was a group of people who, when called upon, would say, yes, we'll shelter someone, we'll give them food, we'll give them clothing, we'll give them transportation. And the lighthouse in Fairport actually has several rooms underneath it, as well as other buildings in Fairport where the enslaved people would actually be hiding in the basement. There's some different stories about people who were looking for fugitives who would come out. They would go into the bar, they would have a drink, and they didn't realize that in the basement below them were people who were actually hiding out. So it was that close, and those people who lived in our area felt it was that important to support this abolition movement and to make sure that these people could get to freedom. I think that's a really important part of our heritage. The last few things I want you to know about that are that we have some amazing resources available. One of those is the Ohio Historical Underground Railroad Trail. This is something I just found when I was doing some research this week, and I was very shocked to find out that Lake County, Ohio is not on this trail. So a few of us at Lake County Historical Society are going to work on this year. We're going to make sure that we share the story of the Underground Railroad in Lake County, and that we share how important it was to our ancestors that they would help with this movement of abolition. All right, that is our presentation on Underground Railroad, and I'd like to welcome our next presenter up now.
So Ohio has a lot of firsts, and Lake County has a lot of firsts as well. So I'd like to talk now about the first female mayor in the country. Her name was Amy Kalkkonen, and she was from Fairport Harbor. So Amy was born in 1891, and she was raised in Conneaut by her parents. Her parents moved here from Finland, so her parents were immigrants. She attended the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and she started a first practice out in Ashtabula, and then she eventually moved to Fairport in 1920 and opened her own private practice attached to her house. Now, at this time in 1920, Fairport Harbor was one of the biggest shipping towns in the entire country. There were a lot of ships coming in hauling iron ore across Lake Erie, and they were all stopping in Fairport Harbor. Because of that, it was mostly populated by a lot of immigrant dock workers. So if you can picture 1920s Fairport, there were more bars in that town than there were churches. There were more bars than there were square miles of Fairport Harbor. So what do ship dock workers like doing on their night off? They all go to the bars and they would start drinking. Problem was, this was 1920s, and what was coming up in 1920? Prohibition, where all of a sudden, all of that alcohol was illegal. And so you can't necessarily cut something like that out of people's culture and their everyday life, and Fairport didn't by any means. And that was a problem for Dr. Kalkkonen, because the majority of her patients were coming in with broken bones, they were coming in bloody and beat up. Bar fights and alcohol poisoning were the #1 reason she was getting patients to her private practice. And she wasn't a fan of that. That was a problem for her. She would repeatedly report these things to the police and be like, okay, alcohol is a problem, they're finding it somehow, even though it's illegal, and the police were doing nothing about it. In fact, one night she was called to one of the bars because someone brought a gun into the bar and shot someone else. That person was an off-duty police officer, and he shot another police officer. The problem was, Fairport only had 2 police officers. So the very next day, Amy Kalkinen announced that she was going to run for mayor and she was going to clean up Fairport Harbor. That was going to be her thing. Now again, this is 1920, so this is before, well, at the same time, the whole women's suffrage movement is going on. So there's some very prominent ladies around Lake County who are really fighting hard for the right for women to vote and the right to be allowed to vote at all. And Dr. Kalkinen was not one of those people. She didn't want anything to do with the women's suffrage movement. She was mainly focused on being a doctor and taking care of her community. So she ran for mayor not based on being a woman in politics, not wanting to enter into the political arena. She just wanted to stop the alcohol poisoning that she was seeing in her medical practice. She didn't look like the typical suffragette either. Amy, I don't have a picture of her, but she had short bobbed hair. She wore skirts that were right below her knee. So she didn't look like, you know, Susan B. Anthony, who was still wearing her hoop skirts and her black cloaks and all of that. She was considered a modern 20s lady. She was medically opposed to corsets, which also made a lot of the suffragettes a little bit uncomfortable. But again, she was a doctor, right? So she ran for mayor, and she was opposed not just by all of the bar owners and the rum runners that were just running rampant in Lake County and Fairport, but a lot of men who didn't want women in politics at all. So she had a lot of opposition, but she did win her election. So now we have the first female mayor. Even though she won, she was still receiving a lot of threats. So President Woodrow Wilson actually sent her a letter of congratulations, and he gifted her 2 wolfhound dogs and told her to take them with her wherever she went so that they could attack her naysayers. So if you've got the President of the United States giving her 2 big scary dogs as her political tool, that's really saying something about the impact that she was going to have. In order to tackle this alcohol problem, she instituted a mayor's court, and basically what that meant was that any establishment that wanted to serve any kind of food or beverage, even soda fountains, were going to have to get a special mayor's license to sell whatever they wanted to sell. She would then go in and personally inspect the business to make sure that alcohol wasn't being served there. This led to a lot of the pool halls, the dance halls, the soda fountain shops, all of these places that had previously been serving illegal alcohol were all of a sudden getting shut down, because if you had any alcohol on premises, she was confiscating the alcohol, all of the tools around making the alcohol. She was also confiscating the money and the profits from the alcohol, and that was how she was able to fund a new police department, because that was necessary now that they didn't have any anymore. So she was going in and literally busting down doors, and there's pictures of her holding just crates and crates of alcohol. She's holding up parts to stills, and she really was inspecting every single business in Fairport. She built a lab attached to her doctor's office, and she was getting samples of every beverage that was being served in Fairport and running it through her analysis, and the ones that were coming back as alcohol with her scientific tests were proven to be nothing more than gasoline with flavored additives in it. She was calling it bathtub gin because they were literally distilling gin in these bathtubs, and it had such a high alcohol content that it would have been lethal if just consumed straight. Also, there was an alcohol called Applejack, and it was all of the local nurseries would just distill their fermented apples that were starting to rot. And the problem was, because it wasn't a regulated industry anymore, the fermentation process wasn't being done properly, so bacteria was getting into the Applejack. So when people started drinking it, they were getting these deadly bacteria in their gut, also causing them to be sick, also causing them to be her patients. So she was really trying to look out for people's safety, and it wasn't necessarily that alcohol was bad, it was that all of this illegal, unauthorized, and not being prepared properly alcohol was what was actually killing people. Unfortunately, she did not finish out her term in office. She left and moved to Seattle in 1923, and when she lived in Seattle, she got married, she had a family, she had a medical practice all out there. Eventually, she moved back to Painesville after her retirement, and she passed away in 1984. She was 93 years old. When she moved back, she lived in Painesville for a while. She had a private apartment, and then she lived in a nursing home out in Madison, and she's buried next to the nursing home in Madison. She never talked about being mayor. It's even said that her kids, for the longest time, never knew that she was the first female mayor. No one knows the reason why she left. It's assumed because the threats just got to be too much. She was constantly under threat. She was getting letters almost daily. People were barging into her office and there was a story about one guy came in, threw a stack of $500 worth of $100 bills and various coins just on her desk and told her to leave. In 1920s, $500 is a lot of money. And she just kept refusing and kept refusing. Someone threw a rock through her window one night. Someone burnt down the back part of her mother's house. So it was just believed generally that the threats got to be too much, and by the time she left, she had already straightened out the bar situation, and Fairport was fairly clean by 1923. It only took her a couple years to do that. So she just quietly moved away to Seattle, and after that lived a fairly non-existent life. So she went from being one of the most famous ladies in the entire country, she was in all of the headlines nationwide, to just retiring quietly to live her life as a normal doctor. So that's her story, but I think she's got a lasting legacy for us. She really did cut down on all of the alcohol problems that were facing Fairport and all of those sailors' lives, and she wasn't a civil rights leader hero. She wasn't out to help the women's suffrage movement. She didn't want her name in all of the headlines. She just wanted to help her community. So I think she was a really good role model for us in that aspect as well. So the fact that the first female mayor was from Fairport Harbor is a really neat part of our history. So yeah. That's all I have.
Can you all see the 4-H pledge? All right, I'm going to ask you to stand if you're able, and you have to put your hand over your heart and help me recite this. This is very important. This is how you begin all your meetings. Ready? I pledge my head to clearer thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, and my health to better living for my club, my community, my country, and my world. All right, you can sit down now. All right, you've all just become 4-H members. How do you feel about that? So were any of you in 4-H? Oh my goodness, this is wonderful. All right. Mandy, I'm going to ask you to help me. Can you bring those 2 photos that I left right there? Thank you. I'm going to have Mandy hold these up for you. So these are little tiny newspaper clippings from a very long time ago. This is my cow, Red. Red and I won every contest we ever entered because she was a very good-looking Jersey cow. However, she never gave very much milk, so my dad always bemoaned that. He said, well, she looks good, but she doesn't produce. So, with that said, thank you, Mandy. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about 4-H. 4-H is one of those opportunities where it has a very rich history, especially starting out in Ohio. And so talking this month about the innovations and all the firsts in Ohio, I think we can feel really proud about our connection to the 4-H program. Just to tell you a little bit of history about 4-H. In 1900, about 60% of Americans still lived in a rural setting. And researchers at public universities like The Ohio State University were really doing a lot of farm research, and they found that adults in the farming communities did not readily accept their agricultural discoveries. For example, things like using hybrid corn things like sanitizing your milk, which I know we find unbelievable right now, but they didn't believe in sanitizing their milk, and also things like home canning and safety with preserving food. The researchers realized that young people were open to new thinking and would experiment with new ideas and share their experiences and successes with their parents. So because of this, we started to see a movement in the late 1800s to educating young people. The idea being that if they learned things at school and in clubs, that they would take it home and they would teach their parents. And actually, I know someone who's a dentist, and they tell me that's the same thing around the world. He goes on dental mission trips every year. He takes toothbrushes, and the little kids love them, and the older people in the village say, oh, I don't need that. So it's really interesting how human nature just doesn't change, does it? At any rate, the seed of 4-H lies in this practical hands-on learning, and this was really connected to someone we're going to talk about in a few minutes, who's Thomas Harvey, who's here from Painesville, Ohio. The early programs that we see started with youth programs in Clark County, Ohio, which is western Ohio, and we know that a man named A.B. Graham started such a program in January of 1902. We also know there was a similar club started in Winnebago County, Illinois. That was started by a Mr. O.J. Kern. And the funny thing is, I love the fact that we were a month ahead of them. We were first. And as part of this program, they were very interested in putting together project-oriented clubs having to do with agriculture. As you know, they've expanded since then. There's many other projects you can do, but the idea was to start with this agriculture program to reach out to all areas of the farm. So that could be farming, it could be livestock, it could be sewing, cooking, canning, all these different kinds of projects. The clover pin, which you can see right here, with the 4 H's on it, was actually developed in 1910, and by 1912, groups around the country were beginning to be called 4-H clubs. In 1914, Congress passed the Smith-Lever Act and created the USDA and the Cooperative Extension System. So some of you may know that we have a wonderful group here in Lake County called our Ohio Extension Service. And when this was passed, we started to have funding with Boys and Girls Clubs, agriculture, home economics, and related subjects. And that became nationalized to become the National 4-H Organization. After World War II in the 1940s, we saw some additional changes. A group of young Americans went to Europe in 1948, and they also had an exchange program where a group of European students and teachers came to the first International Farm Youth Exchange. Since then, tens of thousands of people have participated in 4-H with trips throughout the United States and also throughout the world. The 4-H began to expand into urban areas in the 1950s, and then the programming was also extended to look at different things beyond just farming and homemaking. Things like rocketry, computers, robotics, anything that you can imagine related to science and technical things especially. Later on, 4-H started to look at personal growth. So life skills development was built into the 4-H project's activities and focus. And that's one of the things I love about the 4-H pledge, is that I can remember even as a kid reciting this and thinking, what can I do to help my community and help my world be a better place? And I think that's what's led to the enduring success of 4-H. So you might have asked what's been happening recently. Well, an interesting thing, in 2020 with COVID, we saw a lot of changes in the way that children and people were coming together. Obviously, small groups were only 10 people or less getting together. And what we saw after that was a lot of focus on going into the schools. A lot of 4-H clubs just were not able to survive, just changes in the last few years. So what I love about this is now they are rebuilding, and they're doing a lot of after-school programs. A lot of programs where kids can come in from a latchkey kind of a program or an after-school, and they can actually participate in 4-H that way. I know that we have a couple of new clubs that are starting up this year right here in Lake County, cooperating with different schools and different groups. Today we have over 6 million youth per year participating in 4-H. We have 35 million alumni, so those of you who are in 4-H are part of that alumni group. And every year we have over 500,000 volunteers and we have 3,000 paid staff who are participating with 4-H. I did bring a couple things to show off for you besides my picture of my cow. So I'm going to grab those for you real quick. We'll see if you can tell me what level made these. So does anybody know what this is? It's a little skirt. How many seams are in the skirt? 4. So this is the first project that you make in 4-H. You make a little skirt or a pair of shorts. And what's really important about this is learning how to use a pattern, learning how to measure, learning how to cut fabric, which can be tricky. And this was actually the skirt that my daughter made. I was a 4-H advisor for 5 years, and I'm getting ready to restart a club. But it was so cute to watch her work on this. And this took days and days and days to make. And now she has a sewing machine, and she whips up things all the time. So I also taught all my boys to sew, too. They all made pillows, and they can hem their pants and sew on buttons and that sort of thing. All right, so this is a first-year project. This is a first-year woodworking project. So what is this? A box. Now, what's hard about making a box? Getting it square. Has anyone ever tried to work in 3 dimensions before? This is actually really hard. This is actually supposed to be a flower box. It has 3 little holes drilled in the bottom of it. We use this in one of the bathrooms. It's like a decorative little kind of a shelf thing. What I'd love to have you know, though, is the children who made these went on to do some amazing things. So my daughter's making quilts, outfits, all kinds of things. My boys, who all made these, have now gone on to have a complete set of Milwaukee tools. You don't want to know how many toolboxes that takes, by the way. They each have their own set. And now they can make furniture, and they do plumbing and electrical and all kinds of things. So I just love the fact that we could start out with a kid making this tiny project. And then I'm going to share with you 3 of kind of the final capstone projects that we have. I can't reach that one, so I'll leave it up there. All right, so the white dress is a prom dress that I made. Yes, I did fit in it. I don't know why I decided to make a white prom dress, but it was so much fun. You can come up afterwards and look at it later if you want to ooh and ah at all the trim work and everything. This project is a coat that I made. And again, you can come up and look. I did French bound buttonholes. Yes. This took a really long time. And then finally, this is probably my favorite project ever. This is a 2-piece dress. So there's an underskirt that's a completely separate dress with this over. This actually won the prize at the county fair. This won grand prize at the county fair. So these were 3 things that I took with me my whole life. I put them in a box under my bed and made sure I took them with me. So I hope that you'll think about all the amazing skills that you might have learned over the years. And also, I'd love to see us as aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents, neighbors, really encourage young people to get into 4-H again. I think there's a lot of things that they could learn from trying out these different skills and from learning how to do these things. And I think it would be so exciting to see that have a resurgence, especially here in Lake County. All right, thank you.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. I'm not sure where it is currently. My name is Alexandra Lawson. I'm joining you today from the International Women's Air and Space Museum in Cleveland, and I'm excited to share some interesting aviation firsts in Ohio. We'll be talking a little bit about the first Women's Air Derby in 1929, both the link that derby itself has to Ohio, Cleveland specifically, and some important women who were part of it. So I like to get my audience involved just a little bit, even if it's a show of hands. So how many of you knew that one of our most beloved female aviators, Amelia Earhart, flew in and out of what is now Cleveland Hopkins Airport? Show of hands? A few? Awesome. She actually spent her fair share of time in the Cleveland area multiple times, not just once. Before her adventures in the aviation world, Amelia was spending some time in Canada during World War I. She was working as a nurse's aide, tending to wounded soldiers in Spadina Hospital in Toronto. And during her nursing training, Amelia became acquainted with a woman named Loretta Schimoller, who would later organize what would become the Aerial Nurse Corps of America. We don't know the exact date that this happened, but we do have a photograph in our collection that shows Loretta and Amelia standing at the snow at then Cleveland Municipal Airport. It was probably sometime in the 1920s or 30s, but we're not sure on the date. Amelia also made a pit stop in Cleveland in December of 1930. This stop was dubbed a mystery flight. It was Amelia Earhart and her soon-to-be husband, George Putnam, and they had a very sudden flight from Newark to Cleveland. Despite the evidence of a marriage license being taken out some weeks beforehand, both of them were very firm in their denials that that flight was just the first flight of their trip to the altar. A lot of people don't realize that, this is something good to keep in mind through this presentation, a lot of people don't realize that back in the 20s and 30s, there wasn't really such a thing as direct flight as if it was over a pretty short distance. So even the air race we're talking about is many legs of a race. They would take off and then land in a location and then take off again and go. So that's how this air race that we're talking about is multiple days. It's not just one big long flight like we are capable of doing today. But a year and a half before this mystery flight of Amelia's, she landed in Cleveland, which marked the end of the first of what would be a series of very famous air races, known as the Women's Air Derby, or later on in the 1940s, it became known as the Powder Puff Derby, which many more people are familiar with. So Amelia, when she landed, she was absolutely swarmed by reporters and fans after crossing the finish line at Cleveland Municipal Airport. So Cleveland was chosen as the finish line for this very first air race, and it was held in 1929. So after being prohibited from many earlier air races, women were finally able to enter an air race, enter the aviation world, and show what they were capable of at this first Women's Air Derby. As the first modern airport in the U.S., and having already hosted several years of the national air races, which was primarily men, until this point at least, Cleveland was chosen to represent that finish line of this new race. There were 20 women who competed altogether, and they departed from Santa Monica on the first of a 17-stop air race on August 18th, 1929. So like I said, it wasn't just one or even two flights. There were 17 stops in between Santa Monica and Cleveland. There was a distance of 2,759 miles to cover, and $8,000 total prize money was on the line. So in 1929, $8,000 is quite a lot. So there was a lot of money on the line for this air race. Now, the race was not without its difficulties. Amelia Earhart struggled with a stuck starter at the beginning of the race. After some speedy repairs for that, she was quickly off the ground. But then, on the flight from Santa Monica to San Bernardino, Amelia's plane propeller was damaged. The race was actually put on hold until she could get it repaired, which really ruffled the feathers of some fellow competitors, including another one named Pancho Barnes, who received no such pity when she experienced a minor crash in Texas. Another thing to keep in mind about aviation in this time period is minor crashes were really just minor crashes. We think of a plane crash today, everything stops. But back then, if it was minor enough, fix up what you need to fix up and keep on going. That was their mindset in these early days of aviation. So they were no strangers to plane malfunctions or minor crashes, although with this race in particular, there is some evidence that some of these malfunctions might have been more than just accidents. There was definitely a little bit of sabotage going on. Another aviator in the race, her name was Blanche Noyes, and we're going to talk about her again in a few minutes. She experienced an in-flight fire caused by a cigarette in her baggage compartment. Curiously, Blanche didn't smoke. Another competitor, Claire Fays, discovered 2 broken wing wires while she was flying, which were suspected to have been secretly coated with acid pre-flight. So sabotage was definitely the name of the game in some situations, and we don't know if these were fellow women competitors. We kind of doubt that, although it's not unheard of, or rather some of the male aviators who were still a little bit angry that the women were finally getting their own air race. But despite the multitudes of dangers, 14 of the 20 competitors crossed the finish line at Cleveland Municipal Airport nearly 9 days later from the start on August 26, 1929. The overall winner of the race clocked a total air time of 20 hours, 19 minutes, and 4 seconds. And what do we think? The obvious winner, I think, is Amelia Earhart, right? Oh, nobody's sure. That's good. You're right. It was not Amelia Earhart. I usually try to trick people with that, and most of the time it works, to be honest. It was actually another competitor named Louise Thaden. She won first overall. She was a native of Arkansas, and she had actually earned her pilot's license, or her pilot's certificate, as they sometimes called it, only 1 year earlier, and she had set the women's altitude record in December of 1928. She finished first in the heavy aircraft class, which was determined first overall. So just for some perspective, Louise had had her license for just about a year at this point. Amelia had had hers for about 8 years at this point. So she'd already gotten that license, entered the air race, won the air race, and she set the women's altitude record. So Louise was absolutely crowded by fans and reporters immediately after landing in Cleveland, and a big horseshoe of roses was placed around her neck for her victory. But Louise decided that her airplane was the real champion, and she moved that horseshoe of roses up onto the nose of her plane, and there's a great photograph of that we have in our collection. Of those 20 competitors, we remember that 6 did not either finish or place in the race. Competitor Bobby Trout did finish, but records show she did not place. Margaret Perry contracted typhoid fever midway through and had to withdraw. Pancho Barnes and another very famous aviator of the time, Ruth Nichols, both suffered crashes that they were just fine, but their planes suffered damage but beyond immediate repair. Claire Fay withdrew after that wing wire sabotage that she experienced. And one more competitor, Marvel Crossan, was the only fatality of the race, and she was the victim of carbon monoxide poisoning in her cabin, and the plane went down. Louise, the winner, actually also had a close call with carbon monoxide. She was feeling ill while flying her plane on the way to Santa Monica before the start of the race. She realized what the problem was, and she rigged a tube into the cockpit from the outside that enabled her to breathe fresh air throughout the entire race. So she's not only a pilot, but she's an engineer as well, apparently. But Louise, despite catching this, she knew she was very lucky, and she didn't forget her fallen companion, Marvel. So after the race's conclusion, Louise stated, "There is one bit of pleasure that I will get out of winning. I'll now be able to make good my promise. I have won the cup for Marvel, and it will be inscribed with her name and turned over to her people." And she did follow through with that promise. So she was a very humble competitor. We remember earlier I mentioned Blanche Noyes. So we're talking about her especially because we're talking about Ohio first and even Cleveland first. Blanche Noyes placed 4th in the Derby. She was right behind Amelia Earhart, who placed 3rd. Noyes had actually done her first solo flight in a plane in February of that year, so just about 6 months earlier. And only in July of that year, she officially became Cleveland's first female licensed pilot. So she did her first solo in February, she got her license in 1929, and then immediately she took off for Santa Monica and decided to enter this big transcontinental air race. So she's really incredible. After that air race, she went on to become a demonstrations pilot for Standard Oil in 1931, and she continued flying with other corporations until 1935. She joined the Air Marketing Group of the Bureau of Air Commerce in 1936, and later she became a member of the Women's Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. She even joined Louise Thaden as a co-pilot in the 1936 Bendix Trophy race. So she very much went on flying after the first Women's Air Derby in '29. So I just think this is such a cool topic, because listening to what these women said and felt and experienced nearly 100 years ago now during this air race is just incredible, regardless of the setting, regardless of whether it happened out in Santa Monica or here in Cleveland. But I think when we're gathered here today to celebrate Ohio history and our closest city being Cleveland, it all hits a little closer to home, because you realize that these things happened so very close to where we are standing right now. So again, thank you all for coming, and please continue enjoying the presentations. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Gephardt. I'm a park ranger at James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Mentor. And I see that the caption here says I'm going to talk about President Garfield, which I will, but I thought that what I'd actually do today is talk about the Garfield family in Lake County. So I've placed some images here. So on your left, beginning with image of Lucretia Garfield, the First Lady of the United States for 6 months in 1881, with two of her sons, her youngest son Abram and her second oldest son James R. Garfield. And then we see next to that a building which stands on Center Street today. It is the confectionery cupboard, but it was something else before it was the confectionery cupboard, and it has to do with Abram Garfield. Then over here, to your right, we have an image of the Memorial Library in the Garfield home, and within that Memorial Library we have the vault, where Mrs. Garfield preserved her husband's private and public papers. We'll come to that, back to that in just a minute. I'm going to begin with Abram Garfield because he was the youngest of the surviving Garfield children, and he was the architect of the family, and he was a nationally renowned architect. But here in Lake County, I can speak to the confectionery cupboard, which he had constructed, which he designed and had constructed in 1904. It was the first Mentor Public Library building. So he's responsible for that, together with his brother, James R. I'm going to come to James R. in a minute. Then the other prominent building here in Lake County that I know of is, now I've just lost, Wildwood, which is on Little Mountain Road. It was the summer residence of an oil magnate, John Oliver, and Abram Garfield designed that as well. It's a Tudor design. But he was, again, nationally known and built houses, again, relatively locally in Shaker Heights, in Bracknell, where his home was, et cetera, et cetera. Then we're going to come to James R. Garfield. James R. Garfield was the second son of the President, Mrs. Garfield, and here in Lake County, he is particularly influential in Paynesville and in Mentor. Again, he was the moving force to create what is today the Mentor Free Library, the Mentor Public Library. In the late 1880s and throughout the 90s and into the early 1900s, he was essentially the president of the board. He raised money in all kinds of ways. They had lots of different socials and what have you, to which his mother contributed, his sister, and so forth. But he was really the moving force behind what is today the Mentor Public Library. He was also the president of the board for about 40 years of what is today Lake Erie College. And when he died in March of 1950, this was what was said of him by the Board of Trustees of the college. The death of the Honorable James R. Garfield on March 21st was actually the 24th. March 24th, 1950, at the age of 84 years, Mr. Garfield passed away after an illness of several months. A member of the board for 42 years and president for about the entire period, he was unfailing in his leadership and in his abiding interest in the college. It is impossible to express in words the value of the support of this eminent statesman and great person. And I should mention that he was the Secretary of the Interior for 2 years during the administration of President Theodore Roosevelt, and President Theodore Roosevelt played tennis on James Garfield's tennis courts at his estate, which was known as Hollycroft. And if you're familiar with Hollycroft Lane, it's named for that estate, which no longer stands. But he was a very devoted citizen of Lake County, of Mentor, Ohio, obviously very important to the college here in Painesville, and he is buried at the Mentor Civic Cemetery. I could go on and on about him. He was a wonderful man. I'll just say that much. Lucretia Garfield, of course, she was the first lady, wasn't she? But here in Mentor, again, she was helping her son James R. with that library project. She contributed books to the initial library's holdings. She donated a piano for fundraising purposes to the library effort. She and her daughter, Molly, established an organization which I understand is still in existence today. It was called the Miscellany Club, and it was a ladies' debating society. I assume it still is. It was founded in 1898. And, of course, it's a local institution. Again, I believe it is still functioning, but there we have that. Let me see what else I wanted to mention here about those two, and then Mrs. Garfield. Oh, of course, Mrs. Garfield. The Memorial Library in the home on Mentor Avenue. After the President's death, Mrs. Garfield dedicated her life to the memory, preserving the memory of her husband, and she built an addition onto the farmhouse, which is the Memorial Library. And many people will say, oh, it's the first presidential library in the country, which actually it is not. If you think of a presidential library as a space where the public can go and look at the papers of a president, that was not her intention. And so in that sense, it is not the first presidential library in the country, but it is the inspiration for the first presidential library in the country, which is the Hayes Library in Fremont, Ohio. But when you come to the Memorial Library in the home, you see James Garfield's collection of books. There are over 1,600 books in the library alone. And then within the library is the vault. And in the vault, Mrs. Garfield preserved her husband's private and public papers. She had them bound, well, she had them organized chronologically and by topic, and then they were bound. And they remained in that structure for almost 50 years, close to 50 years. 1931, the Garfield children donated them to the Library of Congress. That's where they are today. But what we have in the room today are from some facsimiles of some of the originals. So that's what's being illustrated in this photograph here. So she created what is essentially the inspiration for the modern presidential library. And she did it here in Lake County. All right. So the home was donated by the Garfield children, Harry, James R., Molly, Irvin, and Abram, in 1936 to the Western Reserve Historical Society, which managed it together with an offshoot organization, which you know today is the Lake County Historical Society, and it was managed by those two societies into the 1980s and 1990s. But the children donated the structure and its contents. You come to that house, you are seeing over 85% furnishings that are original to the Garfield family. So we have the Garfield children and Mrs. Garfield to thank for creating that memorial to her husband and then leaving it to the people not only of Ohio, but for the United States, or to the people of the United States. So then we come to James Garfield. Obviously, James Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, did something that no other presidential candidate before him had ever done. In 1880, he conducted a front porch campaign. Groups of citizens, mostly from Ohio and some from Indiana, came in the last weeks of the 1880 campaign in September, principally, very end of September and then throughout October. Groups of farmers, businessmen, college students, and Civil War veterans, black as well as white, in large and small groups, coming off the Lakeshore, Michigan Railroad, Southern Michigan, you know the railroad, to the train tracks that are about 2 miles off, right? And they came up the farm lane. There was a farm lane. His farm extended for 1.5 miles to the north. And they came up the farm lane to his front porch, and he delivered very brief remarks which were welcoming, which were friendly, which were not particularly political, but they were philosophical, and again, very welcoming. And he did this repeatedly throughout the month of October, and of course he won that election very narrowly. But what he did on that front porch was, again, something no presidential candidate before him had ever done. He's interacting with the public. And from that initial front porch campaign of 1880, we have this kind of retail politics where presidential candidates now interact with the voters. That's what he was doing. But again, he's not talking policy, he's not talking politics, he is not attacking his Democratic opponent, General Winfield Scott Hancock. Friendly, philosophical, welcoming. It's really quite nice. At the train depot, which is no longer standing, but which was on Station, what we think of today as Station Street, there hung a banner, and it was reported in the newspapers. A triumphal arch had been erected near the depot at Mentor, one side of which was inscribed with the legend, "Our townsman, James A. Garfield, 1880. And on the other side, it was decorated with James A. Garfield, Ohio's favorite. So, James Garfield, of course, bought a farm in 1876, 160 acres, and he loved that place. He loved being in Mentor. He loved experimenting with crops and farm animals in the 4 years that he had to do that before his presidency and before his untimely death. And then I would also say all the Garfield children, but particularly James R. there, loved that Mentor farm. And the family gathered at the Mentor farm for decades. So the children, their children, and their children came to that place to enjoy each other's company for many, many years. So I would say that there's lots of ways in which the Garfield family has left its imprint on Lake County, through the college, through architecture, through what is today a National Historic Site. So I think those are my remarks. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the presentations.
So this one's about a historical figure that I find really fascinating, and I love that he has such a great connection to Lake County and such a mundane thing that we do hopefully every day. The inventor of dental floss, right? Hopefully we all use dental floss on a daily basis, but I never pick up my floss and think, oh, this was an awesome invention out of Lake County. It's just not something that's in your thought process. You just pick it up and hope to throw it back in the drawer, right? But Dr. Levi Spear Parmalee was born in Vermont in 1790. He was the eldest of 9 children, and he was forced to work on his father's farm. And he absolutely hated farming. So at the age of 22, he walked from Vermont to Boston just to escape having to be a farmer anymore. When he left the farm, His whole family picked up and moved to what is now Perry. They were some of the first settlers out in Perry, and Parmalee House is it still standing? It's on the endangered buildings list. It's not in very good shape, but it is still out there. Again, they owned a 100-acre farm out in Perry. So Levi would come back and visit occasionally, but he never stayed for long because his father was always trying to get him to come back and inherit the farm, and he just wasn't interested. Instead, when he got to Boston, he started an apprenticeship with a dentist, and he studied under him for 3 years before he moved to Quebec and started his own private practice in dentistry. Again, this is almost the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. So if you imagine tooth health at that point in time, it was not a priority for anybody. No one was thinking about keeping their teeth clean or even in their mouths at that time, right? We've heard the horror stories. While he was there, he wrote his first book about the importance of oral hygiene to one's health starting in early childhood. So the first book that he wrote was basically advocating for the importance of cleanliness of your mouth, and that was when he first wrote about using a waxed sewing thread to clean in between one's teeth. What is that? We all know it is dental floss. So again, this is late 1700s he's doing this. And so by the time the second book was published in 1918, 4 of his other brothers in Perry had all studied under Levi at some point. They'd all gone and met him in Boston. When Levi went over to Europe, 2 of his brothers went to Europe and studied dentistry in Europe with him. And they all came back to Lake County, and they were all dentists. So it was a family with 5 very important dentists in it living here in Lake County. Again, an odd family legacy. Everyone was a dentist, but it made Lake County's teeth cleaner at that time, which was great. So at the time, a common practice for tooth problems was a surgeon. You would go to your general doctor, and they would probably just, rather than looking at your teeth, they would just remove the one problem tooth. And Levi wrote about specifically turning keys were used to pry the problem tooth from your gum. Cleaning teeth was usually done with files and scalers, and they would fill your cavities with molten tin foil. So that just gives me shivers to even think about or say. And Levi's whole entire case was that that didn't need to be the solution. You didn't have to torture someone to fix their teeth. He was really advocating for the fact that if people kept their teeth clean in the first place, they wouldn't have the problems that would require big, heavy files going in someone's mouth. Levi liked to travel a lot, so he traveled around the southern states for a time. He got married down in New Orleans. One of his most famous patients was President James Monroe, who could not recommend him highly enough for his less invasive methods of dentistry. Levi continued to travel back and forth to Europe. He was studying a lot in London because London was apparently the center of worldwide dentistry. And so he would go there and learn their new methods, and he would teach them things that he had learned. And he just kept publishing books as well. He ended up returning to New Orleans with his wife, and they lived there for 30 years. And he was so financially successful that he dedicated a lot of his time and his money to cleaning the teeth of children in schools and orphanages for free. So he was really trying to sponsor all kids. He would give them toothbrushes. He was an advocate for toothpaste over tooth powder, which was a big thing at the time. And he really tried to make sure that kids understood that if they kept their teeth clean, they wouldn't have to get like a chisel in their mouth, essentially. So after 30 years in New Orleans, and unfortunately his wife passed at that time, he went to New York City, and he helped establish the American Society of Dental Surgery in 1840. It was that society that actually gave him his degree and certificate in, they coined the term DDS, and they gave him an MD. So it wasn't until very later in life, after decades of actually being a dentist, that he actually became a Dr. Parmalee and not just a Levi Parmalee. Although he was retired by this point, it's ironic because it took him so long to actually get his doctorate, and then it was kind of just an honorary doctorate, but he was known worldwide as a leader in dental health, essentially. On one of his trips over to France, he ended up passing away in 1959, and his body was returned, and he is buried in Perry with the rest of his family in Perry Memorial Cemetery. His contributions to dentistry remain the foundations of modern dental practices. To quote one of his books published in 1821, "Where teeth are kept literally clean, no disease will ever be perceptible." That was in 1821. Common knowledge throughout the world today, right? But he was the one that discovered that plaque could build up on your teeth, and he discovered methods of removing that plaque in a less invasive manner, and he really advocated for the fact that if you kept your teeth clean, you wouldn't get dental disease. And it wasn't until the early 20th century that people were even commonly able to get what we know now as a toothbrush. That kind of device didn't really exist until much later in time. So while he may have never actually lived in Lake County, he certainly spent a lot of time here, and his family was from here, and all of his brothers became dentists here, so I like to think he's credited with Lake County's general good teeth nowadays, right? His methods led to better dental health for people worldwide, and especially here in Ohio. So next time you floss your teeth, hopefully tonight, you'll look at it and be like, this was just once sewing thread in the late 1800s, and now it's $1 million dental hygiene industry, right? So he made all of his money in dentistry. It just kept going on, and now, hopefully, we all use his technologies today, right? That's all I've got. Thank you.
All right, last but not least, we are going to spend a few minutes talking today a little bit more about education. And that's been a recurring theme, I feel, with a lot of the firsts and innovations that happen in Ohio. I feel like in Ohio we've been really leaders with education and promoting new ideas and putting our time and money into research and the time and the devotion needed to improve our society. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes as our last feature today about this gentleman. Anyone know who this is? Thomas Harvey. Does anyone know where the Thomas Harvey House is? Right over there. It's that brown house. Yes, over there. And in fact, there's a beautiful marker out front marking it as the home of Thomas Harvey. I want to start this section out with a quote from Lee Iacocca. And Lee Iacocca was the CEO of Chrysler. He was also an engineer at Ford Motor Company. And I love this quote because it really talks about something very close to many of us. Lee Iacocca said, "In a completely rational society, the best of us would be teachers, and the rest of us would have to settle for something less, because passing civilization along from one generation to the next ought to be the highest honor and the highest responsibility anyone could have." So I'm so glad that we talked today about President Garfield and all of these other innovative people in Lake County, because Thomas Harvey was really an innovator who is kind of our unsung hero. He was born in 1821 in New Hampshire. His family moved to Concord Township in 1833, so he was 12 years old. And I like to see his history kind of as a farm kid who didn't want to be on a farm. So this might be a theme if any of you grew up in a rural setting. He realized by the time he was 12 that he really wanted to learn more. And at that time period, if you were someone like the Garfield family, your family had money, they had influence, you would have a tutor come to your home and you would buy books, which were very expensive, or you would be sent to a boarding school or a day school. And in that day school or that boarding school, you would have teachers and fellow students, and you would be studying the classics. So Socrates, philosophers, Plato, history, religion, mathematics, all those kinds of things. The basic schoolhouse, which we have quite a few of those in Lake County, the Little Red Schoolhouse is one example in Willoughby. The basic schoolhouse, you learn 3 things, the 3 R's. You all know what those are. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that was it. So, most people at that time would go to school till about 3rd or 4th grade. The other thing is that they would only go to school when the weather was bad, because when the weather was good, they needed to be on the farm helping their family. So all of that is really interesting when you look at what happened with Thomas Harvey. As I said, by the time he was about 12 or 13, he realized he did not want to be a farmer. So he arranged with his family to move from Concord all the way to Painesville. I know that doesn't seem that far, but back then, a very far way. He managed to get a position as an errand boy and a copy boy working in the newspaper. So this would have been back in the 1830s. He was doing all kinds of errands. He was doing anything they needed him to do. And he managed to go to school for 3 or 4 months a year. So between what his family could do to support him and then what he could do to earn money, he was buying books and trying to learn as much as he could. Now, interesting thing happened. By the time he was 18, he had figured out a way to make enough money to hire a tutor for himself. And by hiring a tutor, he was getting training in the classics, in all of the literature, and all of the things that someone would get at a fancy boarding school or fancy private education. He then made arrangements to move to Kirtland. In Kirtland, by the time he was 23 years old, he had managed to finish the Western Reserve Teachers Seminary, and that was one of the preeminent places in Northeast Ohio for you to get an education because he decided he wanted to become a teacher. What came next was really fascinating. He moved very quickly with his knowledge, and to me it just shows how innovative he was. Within the next 3 years, he helped establish the Geauga High School in Chardon. He became principal, then a few years after that, of the Seneca County in Republic, Ohio. And then, by the time he was 30 years old, he became the superintendent of the Massillon School District, which is south of here, as you know. All of this by the time he was 30. He was in Massillon for about 14 years. They actually have a huge monument erected to him based on what he did for education down then. And back in 1865, then he was called back to Painesville. So at this time, he would have been about 44 years old. He saw a need throughout Ohio for a really organized curriculum, and he recognized that what we needed here in our area was really based on what was happening in the world around us. In 1865, the Civil War started. When he was called back to Painesville, there were a lot of things developing here with manufacturing, with the railroads, with all kinds of technology. And he recognized that the current curriculum that was being taught was not good enough, that it wasn't preparing people for the workforce. So interestingly enough, a lot of this was also coming from the local businesses. They were looking to hire people, they were looking to expand their companies, and they couldn't do that if the workforce wasn't more educated in primary school and wasn't coming to them with the knowledge that they needed. So what basically happened is between all these years of education, Harvey started to develop a high school curriculum. His curriculum took the private curriculum of the classics and the philosophers. He took the reading, writing, and arithmetic that we saw, and then he added chemistry, botany, and other sciences. In addition, he started writing textbooks. And textbooks were something that really weren't available at that time. A lot of the learning back then was just basic knowledge of whatever your teacher would write on the slate board in front of you, and then you would practice on your slates as well. Interestingly enough, by 1871, he had attracted the attention all over the state of what he was doing in Painesville, and he was appointed the state commissioner for education. He held that post for 3 years, and because of his work and his innovation, Ohio was considered to be the leader in education at that time, and we still are in many ways. Ohio has more colleges and universities per capita than any place in the world. We have the most educational resources available for anyone who might be looking for an education. What was really fascinating about this is that after 3 years of living in Columbus and serving as the state commissioner, he did decide to come back to Painesville. And so he came back to Painesville in the mid to late 1870s. He continued teaching and writing textbooks until 1892, when he passed. There were a couple of things that came out of his innovation. The first thing that came out of that was the introduction of making schools mandatory. Did you know that it wasn't mandatory to go to school? You did not have to go to school. And Ohio was one of the first states that voted and said everyone needed to go to school for a certain number of years. The next thing was things like standards for education, what you should be learning in first grade, second grade, third grade, et cetera. So all of those ideas for curriculum were set up by Harvey. He ended up becoming so famous in the educational world that later, in the 1880s, Rutherford B. Hayes was quoted as saying, "Mr. Harvey is one of the most influential and important men in the United States." So the next time that you're driving down Mentor Avenue and you see the plaque for Thomas Harvey, or you drive by Thomas Harvey High School, which is on Walnut Street, I'd love for you to think about this concept that somebody right here from Lake County was able to see the opportunity for education, the opportunities to help students grow, also to help business and commerce, and to help the community. And I think he's just a wonderful example of someone who is someone that we could model our lives after for his ability to see and to seek improvement in everything that he did. As we conclude today, I'd like to say thank you to a few special people. I'd like to say thank you to Aaron for running our soundboard in the back. So thank you, Aaron. I'd like to say thank you to Maria Strickland and everyone here on the staff at the church. So Maria, thank you for that. I'd like to have our two other speakers stand up. So Mandy, yes, I'm so sorry. These are the two I see all the time. Our three speakers, thank you so much. And finally, thank you so much for participating with this program. Thank you for our wonderful organist for helping to bring us in and out. But the most important part about this is just really celebrating all of the amazing things that have happened in our area and helping to share them with others. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and we look forward to seeing you at many of the events that we have coming up.
Thank you again to everybody that has participated this afternoon. Couple of housekeeping items before we hear our postlude. We have a lot of cookies. Like, we have really awesome cookie bakers at this church, and they have delivered unto us. So, at a ratio of about 15 per person, but 5 if you're on a diet, please, after we're done here, head into the circle room and enjoy some cookies, some fellowship, coffee, tea, hot chocolate. We'd love to have you in there. Secondly, and somewhat more sadly, we did have a funeral this weekend. You can see lots and lots of flowers, and these were left behind. If you would like to take a few roses with you to enjoy, please feel free to do that as well. And at this time, I think we'll turn it over to Bob and Mary Brown and our flutist, Judy Elias. So thank you very much.